So back when I was a senior in high school, my history teacher gave me a book that I didn't fully appreciate at the time, and it wasn't only until the last 2 or 3 years that I really grew to have an appreciation for it. And that book is The Prince by Machiavelli. Now, this book, I found something very interesting right off the bat, and that was that looking at it from a broader perspective, looking at the entire book as itself, a man like Machiavelli, espousing the principles that he does in the book, would not be revered in our modern world. The book essentially teaches you how to be noble, how to take things for yourself, how to understand what other people are doing, and how to always come out on top. And that's something that's very lost in today's modern world, especially in the Western world more than anything, where the democratic process has just neutered all of our noble instincts, and it's beaten them down to the point where there is nothing in government but stale and moldy bread. So one of the things that made me think of this was that I saw a magazine cover recently that was asking if Napoleon is somebody that should be revered or if it's somebody who should be looked at as this horrendous person in history. And the magazine's conclusion was basically, and I forget again exactly what magazine it was, but their conclusion was basically that Napoleon was this horrible person who didn't really embody things that modern man should try to embody. And that to me was just the epitome of the mainstream mindset, where it's altruistic and you're constantly sacrificing yourself and not taking anything for yourself. But Napoleon embodied the exact opposite of that. It was take everything that you can get for yourself and act in self-interested ways and do things that will serve you and the community that you find to be of value to you. So in other words, don't do something that's born out of disinterested motives in the self. So one of the ideas that captured me right off the bat in this book was that the goodwill of the people is a better defense than any fortress. And I think Machiavelli almost uses those words exactly. And that's not an idea that comes up until later in the book. I think it's around chapter 20 when he's talking about fortresses. But it's an idea that you can definitely get some pretext for earlier in the book. And a little tangent here. If you're going to read any part of The Prince, like I don't know if you want to read the entire book. I mean, there's the beginning and the end is very specific to the time period where he's talking about the history of Italy and he's talking about specific princedoms. But if you wanted to if you have like 10-15 minutes to read something, chapter 20 in The Prince, where he talks about fortresses and how a prince should act and things that would be useful or injurious to a prince, that's the chapter to read, because that is more philosophy heavy and more in line with a lot of the things that you see going on with our government and our culture nowadays. It's things that translate a lot easier, where you don't really have to read between the lines that much, even though I still did, and I'm still going to go through some of it here. But another one of the ideas that I took from the book was that you always have to be skeptical of people who help you when they have nothing to gain for themselves directly, when there is nothing that they are obviously going to gain. And as Machiavelli says, he talks about auxiliary troops. Now, auxiliary troops are troops that a native government will bring in from a foreign government. So it's like alliances or assistance from other governments. And he says that when you use the help of auxiliary troops, it's a lose-lose scenario, because you either lose the military conflict and then you're still in disarray, or you win the military conflict and then you're beholden to the power of the auxiliary army to the degree that the power was supplied to you. And just to differentiate a little bit there, that's something that I added in right at the end, that Machiavelli didn't go deep into it, but I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that if you have 70 infantry divisions for your country, if your country has 70 infantry divisions and another country supplies you with 2 or 3, their 2 or 3, those aren't going to overpower your 70 and then overthrow your princedom. That's not going to happen, assuming obviously that the skill is equal. I mean, we see throughout history that it's not equal, but we have to, I'm not talking specific here, so we have to speak as if it is equal. So obviously, like a city-state like Sparta, if they supplied infantry, if they supplied foot soldiers to another nation, they would need far fewer men to overpower the other army that they just fought for if they win the battle, and then overpower that city-state. Like that, it's a different scenario. But if the tables are then turned and say you only have 2 infantry divisions and you get supplied with like 90 from somewhere else, well, if you win the battle, they can very easily overpower your infantry and you. And so that's Machiavelli's point here, is that someone who helps you with no obvious self-interest is likely trying to possess you and overpower you in at least one area. And an example of this that I think is a bit reading between the lines, but I think Machiavelli would certainly appreciate this example, is that people who are overly helpful, people that are altruistic, people that constantly give themselves up, they're trying to possess your problems and overpower your decision-making ability. So they also get an oxytocin release out of it, which is something directly to the self. But they might not even characterize it that way. They might not even say, oh yeah, I'm trying to possess you. But that's what they're doing. They're trying to do that, even if they don't realize that's what they're doing. And I think that if you watch some of my other videos on philosophy, you'll be able to pick up that oftentimes the things that we're doing, we don't know why we're doing them, even if we think on the surface we know why. And this is just a bit of a deeper dive into that, where the people with an altruistic mindset don't know why they're altruistic in many senses, but you can usually go down to the root of nihilism and possession. So another takeaway from this is that you shouldn't take what you can't get for yourself. If you need assistance from someone else, you're opening the door to be beholden to their power to the degree that it's supplied to you. And so what I mean by that specifically is something that I think Nietzsche talks about, and he's talking about how he decides what he should attack and what he should not. And so I'll just read here out of his book, Behold the Man, Ecce Homo. And he says, I attack only those things against which I find no allies, against which I stand alone, against which I compromise nobody but myself. I have not yet taken one single step before the public eye which did not compromise me. That is my criterion of a proper mode of action. And so he's talking about how if you go into battle with somebody else and you win, they're now partially responsible for that victory, and they're going to feel like they're partially responsible. And the chances that you're going to divvy up that victory exactly as they would divvy up the responsibility for that victory is very slim. And that's kind of the problem with socialism is, socialism is people are never going to feel as if they got what they earned or what they deserved. That's the key takeaway, is when you have people just dividing things up, what people contribute is never equal. But what people take will be equal, and you're going to have people who always feel like somebody got more than they deserved, and there's going to be animosity that builds up towards that person. So that's more of a praxeological argument against socialism. There's plenty of economic arguments, but I'm not going to go into those here. So, like I was saying though in the beginning of this, the book doesn't really get good until you get past the beginning. I think it's the first 4 chapters. But once you get into the middle of the book and the latter chapters, it starts to open up more into philosophy. So one of the ideas that he brings about is if you only follow what you deem to be good, you'll be ruined by those who do what you deem to be evil. So this is his idea he draws the dichotomy between the fox and the lion. He says the fox will scare off a wolf, the lion will scare off a wolf, but the fox can sniff out the traps. And you have to possess both to be a successful leader, or in Machiavelli's case, a successful ruler. He's talking about people ruling over other people, but this can be translated to being a leader also. And the difference between a leader and a ruler I covered in a video on the right media that I did recently on a live stream. But the difference is basically that, and you can get deeper into this, but the difference is basically that a leader is somebody whose direction is voluntarily taken on by the people who want to be led, and a ruler, it's imposed on the people. So this can translate to both of those situations. And I think too that when you read Machiavelli, on the surface, it seems very much like a playbook for tyranny. It seems like a playbook for a government to have control over the people. But when you start to read between the lines, you can also see how to prevent tyranny. You can see how to prevent government overstepping their boundaries. And it's not by just doing the opposite of what Machiavelli says. It's by individuals embodying what Machiavelli talks about. It's by the individual being strong and selfish and focusing on what benefits them, because what benefits the individual benefits the society. But the individual will be sacrificed for the society if the society is paramount. Again, another problem with socialism. So he talks about how you have to not just be good, not just be evil. Again, this gets back to the idea you have to do what will, well, I guess if you were going to use a Nietzschean term, you have to do what would be truthful. You have to do what you think will lead to the flourishing of humanity and what will be species rearing and what will serve humanity best. And this is generally, again, selfishness, self-aggrandization, because you possess wealth in a similar way to money, where it's not a zero-sum game, but when you constantly give it away, you're going to decrease the overall amount in the society. When you hold it and when you accumulate it for yourself, then it starts to look like a net positive in the society. It starts to be a net positive in the society. So I think it's the end of chapter 15 he says this. Chapter 15 is very, very short. But the end of chapter 15, he says that some things that look like virtues will lead you to ruin, and some things that seem like vices will lead you to safety. And the idea here is that it's something I've been preaching on the right media for a while, but you have to understand yourself, but you can't set an algorithm for your life. You can't know how you're going to react in certain situations without being in the situations, or at least fully understanding all the aspects that you have to beforehand. And in other words, be unexpected, be adaptable. And that's something that you see translated from Machiavelli up to Nietzsche. And pretty much it's very funny how all successful people, all people who led a life that you could consider noble, all espoused some of these same elements to personality, to character. And I think that those resemble something true. I think that there's something to take from those. And I always find it interesting when there's cross, when you see like similarity between Machiavelli and then you see it in Nietzsche, but it's described differently or perhaps from a different angle. So another one of the things that Machiavelli brings up that I think translates over to our modern political world, or just our modern society in general, is that when people are divided, they cannot unite in their defense against the common enemy of government. And Machiavelli talks about this in the government sense, where a government that's divided cannot protect itself against foreign invasion. Or when the people are separated into factions, you're now weaker against a foreign invasion, but the people are also weaker against the government itself. And so when the people are divided, the government can take more power for itself. It doesn't have to wait for the people to give them the power. In America and the Western world now, with democracy, which is really just a democratic process, it looks like that's the case. It looks like the people have to give the government more power, but the government is just taking it. And that's something I think to recognize. But this goes back to the idea of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's the enemy of the people, of the populace, is the government. The the enemy of the native people is the native government. The enemy of the native government is a foreign government. So the friend of a fractioned people is the foreign government. And the fractioned people will be more likely to help the foreign government than their native government. And that's something, again, that we see in the modern political sphere nowadays. And when we look at the democratic process, again, the more that I learn about democracy, the democratic process, human physiology, praxeology, just human nature in general, you see that it's the democratic process that's turned America and the Western world in general into something of stale bread. It is just something that's there that is not acidic or basic. It's not powerful or, well, I shouldn't say it's not powerful or weak, because it is weak in a certain sense, but there's nobody specifically noble, but it fosters this sort of weakness in man that is almost numbing or intoxicating because it feels so good. You know, to be able to just indulge in government handouts and to live in a society that's built on debt. And the only reason that our society can be built on debt nowadays is because we're consuming for things we didn't produce because other places are producing and not consuming. And so you look at a place like China or Thailand or Vietnam or other places where they have these dilapidated industries, and we're consuming at the expense of them because, and this goes into the Federal Reserve, central banking, how we're just printing money. I'm not going to get into that, even though the Federal Reserve did just cut interest rates again. Oh boy, hopefully Keynesian economics will work now. It won't, but hopefully, I shouldn't even say hopefully it'll work. It's not going to, and I hope that it doesn't, because otherwise our money's going to be worthless anyways. So this goes back, though, to an idea also: when the people are divided, then the government can take more power for itself. This is something that people will often say is okay when, well, they'll say that it's okay because the people are part of the government. So as long as the government is united, then we're fine. But Rothbard brings up the idea, Murray Rothbard, he brings up the idea that, and this is right in the beginning of his book, Anatomy of the State, that the people are not the government. You cannot conflate the people and the government because they are not the same. The government has powers over the people that the people do not have. And that is the ability to use force, unreciprocated force, on a peaceful person. So, moving on, though, with the prince, another idea that Machiavelli brings up that I think is very interesting is that there's never been a prince who takes over a populace and then disarms them unless he's conquering another place. If he's adding to his princedom, he will disarm the populace and then take people from his original population that he knows to be loyal. He'll arm them, they'll already be armed, and he'll bring them to the new place, and then they'll have the guns and the other, or, well, Machiavelli's time, it's, I don't know, whatever military weapons they use, swords, cannons, whatever, what have you, and they'll have them in the new place, in the new the new city, state, whatever you want to call it, the new locale, but the native population will not have them. And you only arm a new populace if they were not previously armed. So then they'll feel like you trust them and they'll be in good favor with you. And then those arms that you gave them are yours. They will stand and fight with you because they know that you trust them. And you're showing trust to them by giving them the arms. It's the same thing, like you don't arm, like back in when they had slavery, you didn't arm the slaves because they were not yours. They did not have goodwill towards you, and those arms could very easily be used against you. And the other idea to take away is that you cannot arm all of your subjects. So then those who are armed are benefited, and you can deal with the disarmed more freely. And that's an idea to keep in mind for America nowadays, where they're trying to disarm many people in the society, but they're trying to aggrandize government. And that shows the dichotomy right there between the government and the people. They are not the same. There is one that the government is tied in tight with, and that is military, police, other branches of government that are armed, and then the populace that's meant to be controlled. So then, to discuss something else in the Prince, to get back to the idea of factions. So factions are harmful because an enemy among a divided people is going to be an easy conquest. Like I said before, when the people are fractured, an outside enemy will very easily take over the people. And it's the same thing with the government. A fractionated government will very easily be taken over. But an idea to keep in mind is that the weakest factions, the factions that are most distrustful of their current government, I shouldn't even say weakest because it's not particularly the weak factions, but the factions that are most distrustful towards their own native government are going to assist the enemy, and combined, they'll likely be able to overthrow the factions that are more in line with the native government, that are more sympathetic towards the native government, more accepting of the native government. And when you look at America nowadays, I mean, again, you can abstract a lot of this to the people versus the government. And it's a fractured people cannot unite to fight the common enemy of the government. And the government right now, like, we like to think, oh, they're fractionated. Yeah, there's Republican, there's Democrat, there's pro-Trump, there's anti-Trump. But you can't think of it like that. It is all people who can use force, unreciprocated force, against a peaceful populace. That's all that it is. It is a body that is not the people. It is completely separate. And I talked about Machiavelli's the chapter 20 in the Prince, where he talks about fortresses and things that a prince could embody that can either be useful or injurious. And he talks specifically about fortresses. And he says that fortresses are helpful when the people are the primary threat, when the native population is the primary threat to the government. But fortresses are harmful when foreigners are the primary threat. But he says that the best fortress is to not be hated by the people. And I think I said that at the beginning of this video. The best fortress is to not be hated by the people, because then when an enemy attacks, they will aid you. But the US government nowadays, the Western governments in general, they're not all that concerned with invasion because they have alliances. They are all willing to supply auxiliary armies to one another, if you use Machiavelli's terms. And so they don't see, these governments are united. When there is an alliance among governments, they are united. They're saying, if one of us is attacked, either internally or externally, either domestically or from a foreign power, then we're all going to coalesce and unite to fight against that enemy. And so now you're starting to see not just the monopoly of government, that's a monopoly by definition, but you're seeing a monopoly of governments around the world where they're ganging up on populaces, where they're also ganging up on to make sure that there's not foreign invasion. But the whole idea with alliance is that that's how you get to global war. That's how you get every country involved in war. And central banking doesn't help that. I mean, I've said it many times before that it's no coincidence that the era of central banking coincides with the era of global war. That is no coincidence. I mean, we have things that were granted to the legislation that was passed to make it easier to inflate the US currency when we went into World War I, which we never should have gotten involved in, when we went into World War II, and these things are still on the books. We're still paying on a lot of these. I wish I could remember exactly what it was, but there were a few things that were passed that made it so that the government could expropriate wealth from the populace, and they said, well, it's just for the war, it's just in wartime. But then it didn't end, it kept going. And this was kind of the idea with income tax and I wish I could remember the other ones. There were a few others. But regardless, this is the government, again, taking the power that it wants, and it's creating conflict. And this is something else Machiavelli talked about, controlling both sides of a conflict to make yourself look better. We see governments do this all the time, where they get into a war, or they do something to rally the people around their own government so that they trust their own government more. almost by distrusting others. And this is where we saw like the Patriot Act came into play. Whatever you think about 9/11, I'm not getting into the conspiracies here. And I don't say conspiracy in a negative way. I'm just identifying it that way. I'm not getting into that on this episode right here. But no matter what you think of it, you cannot doubt that the US government used that to self-aggrandize, that they use that to give more power to themselves. That cannot be denied. I mean, that is blatantly obvious just looking at the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act. Notice how these things are always named in a way that makes them seem like they're benevolent, but really they're malevolent. I mean, look at affordable health care. Look at the Affordable Care Act. Yeah, it's real affordable, isn't it? Yeah, where it's more beneficial to just pay the penalty, even though Trump got rid of that. But under Obama, it was more beneficial to just pay the penalty than to actually pay for the health care. Unless you're somebody who doesn't produce anything and all you do is take and your entire survival's propped up by government. But we know how I feel about people like that. So that was my takeaway from the print. I hope that you appreciated it. This was, I like keeping this nice and refined. Like I said, the prints, you can see it's not a dense book. I mean, in this format right here, it's only 127 pages. It's not long at all. And I mean, there are some chapters in here that are 1 or 2 pages. So I hope that you enjoyed this and finding out a little bit more about the prints. I left down in the description, I left a PDF link to the prints, and if you want to buy it, by all means you can. I know some people don't like reading on the screen, but again, thank you so much for watching this. I really appreciate all of the support, and I'll see you guys in the next one.